The brothers who trek about. And if there's one thing that we know a lot about, that's about being brothers. And conveniently, the name of this episode is Brother. So hopefully we will have many things to say on this new episode of Star Trek Discovery Season 2, Brother. We are the brothers who trek about. My name is Matt, and coming to us from the east side of this state is my brother Ken. Say hello, Ken.
Coming to us from the east side
Live long and prosper.
As always is my brother
there
Ken.
You go.
Say hello, Ken.
Equally important in this episode is there's a
Live
lot of
long
Vulcan
and
stuff to
prosper
talk about, so
We
we'll
are
definitely
going to
get
deep
to
dive
that
this week
for
into the
sure.
Vulcan, and all their
before we
repressed
do, let's
emotions.
start off with some interesting
that's
stuff behind
ahead.
the scenes,
Look forward to
shall we?
that. But before we do, we got some interesting stuff going on behind the scenes. Alex Kurtzman, ladies and gentlemen.
Some of you may have seen or some of you may not have seen, but Alex Kurtzman has been making the rounds as Discovery Season 1 opens up. Season 2, I mean. He's been talking to a lot of people, doing a lot of interviews and saying some fun stuff. But interestingly, he said this. This is about his version of Trek, which is, I go back to my childhood and Luke Skywalker. The Star Wars farm boy who looks out at the twin suns of Tatooine and imagines his future. Trek never gave me that, he says. Trek was always fully formed adults, already in Starfleet, and people who have decided who they are. And it was never aspirational in that way. It's important for me to find a way to go back and reach younger kids in a way that Trek should, but never really has. Well, what do you think about that quote coming from the guy who's in charge of all of Trek on CBX?
So, part of it is that we're getting a more archy Star Trek, right?
Which we don't hate.
Right. But, I mean, there's different kinds of arcs, right? You know, if we look at the bulk of literature, there's two kinds of arcs. One is the plot arc, right? Somebody wants something badly, they can't get it. They struggle, opposition is overcome, object is seized. In a sense, the thing they seek is a MacGuffin, right? What we want to ask is, are you getting closer or further away from the thing that you seek? And the struggle is like about overcoming opponents. James Bond, classic, right?
Okay.
His character doesn't change. Basically. I mean, you've got some exceptions, but basically the character does not change. But he's always pursuing something. The nuclear device, you know, underwater with the captured airplane, the plans, the finding out what Dr. No is up to. He's seeking something. And he's fighting these opponents. And it's fun to watch because it's got this adventure piece to it. And we certainly have that. I think the whole middle section of this episode is that kind of structure, right? When they're on the asteroid, they meet the engineer. The other kind of classic story is about the character who undergoes an internal transformation, right? So you could say Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. At the beginning, she doesn't like Kansas. She's not happy where she is. She wants to go over the rainbow. And through her travels, she realizes that there's no place like home, and she wants to go back.
Mm-hmm.
And when she gets back, she has a new appreciation of the people and the situation. And that kind of internal transformation is this thing that they're talking about. And it's easiest to do when you do have somebody who's kind of in a beginning, unformed, doesn't know, and finds themselves, right? Now, there's other stories you can tell. You could have the gruff captain who's not sure he wants to keep doing this. Maybe I should, become a Orion slave girl trader, as Pike suggests in The Cage, right?
Right.
And he's got to find something that he's missing. Satisfaction with what he's doing. Maybe he finds a love interest and he finds love and that completes his. Or maybe he finds spiritualism. Or maybe he learns how to play. Or maybe he makes new friends. Or maybe he discovers a new people and rescues them and appreciates their culture. And he grows as a person and now says, no, I don't need to leave. What I'm doing here is good stuff. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's other kinds of stories about personal growth. But that one, right, we call it kind of an overarching myth. The hero story, he starts off and he's a nobody and he gets a call to adventure and he refuses it. And the monomyth, right? And so that's one in which you kind of take an immature person and you gradually have them go through some adventures and situations and they mature and they become this complete person. And in a sense, Star Trek presumes, with its level of competence, that most people have gotten there. Mm-hmm. You could tell a story about Tilly, right? Tilly's got room to grow. But if your story is on Captain Kirk or Captain Picard, especially Captain Picard, because he's already got a lot of captaincy behind him when he gets on the Enterprise.
Right.
Whereas, Sisko, he was a commander. He had been, an XO. Kirk is new in his command. I suppose Janeway had some seasoning, but for Picard especially, it's hard to have him discover himself. He's got to have one of these other arcs where he learns to appreciate children, or opens himself up romantically to whoever it's going to be, Crusher or some other person. Or so those are my thoughts on the quote that you read.
Fair. Well, that was a lot and good. It's funny because we talk about JJ Trek and the idea that JJ Trek is basically Star Wars infusing itself into Star Trek. Here we have Kurtzman, who, of course, not only helped with that movie, but, also basically just quoting Star Wars as, his template for what he thinks the show should be. So that's interesting. I think, for me as a Star Wars fan, I'm all about, let's do some more Star Wars. That's fine. But, there is something that I like about Trek. If you look at the movies, the original movies, your Rathacons and whatnot, there is more adventure in it than perhaps was in the original series. And, certainly the first couple seasons of The Next Generation.
Although in one of the movies did he ever fight a Gorn?
True.
It's hard to beat some of the compelling adventure we've gotten in that series, even just so far.
No, that's fair. Somebody also asked him the question if they thought that they were going to meet up with Kirk, if we were going to see, young Kirk take over the Enterprise or whatnot. He said, what Kirk is doing at this particular time is a whole other question, and we don't have any immediate plans for that character. Plus, I'd have to talk to Shatner about it. So that's funny. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Anson Mount here, who plays our Pike very well, I might add.
I think so, yep.
We'll get into him much more here as the show goes on. Bowie, he was born in Mount Prospect, Illinois, which is fun, but then grew up in White Bluff, Tennessee. He has many credits to his name, most notably. Here are some of the most notablies. He was in the first season of Smallville, which is fun.
What did he do then?
I don't know. He was in one episode.
Wow, I gotta look that up.
I know, right? And then he was with Michael Rosenbaum in the movie Pool Hall Junkies, right? Who played Lex on Smallville. He had a small role in the movie Boiler Room. He did one episode of Lost, right? More Kurtzman and JJ. He also had great parts over many episodes in many shows. Most notably, he was one of the leads in Hell on Wheels on the AMC network with Cole Meany, of all people. And during the 5th year of that show, he became the producer as well. Unfortunately, last year, he was also cast in that ill-fated Inhuman show that was on ABC. It was one of those Marvel X-Men shows, and it was really bad and did not go very far. So luckily, that cleared the way so that he could come on and do this show for us. So that's really great. I'm glad he's here.
I really enjoyed his characterization of Pike.
Uh-huh. Yeah, definitely. I thought he was great. One other interesting piece of information is that his father, Anson Adams Mount II, was one of the original contributing editors to Playboy magazine. So that's something. So we'll sort of start getting into it right here. This week, we're going to run things a little bit different than we normally do. We're not going to do quite the recap that we normally do. Again, I usually did it because you've all seen this original series episodes a million times. You don't have to go back and watch each episode. But I figure with Discovery, now you guys are probably on board. You've already watched the first episode. It was only a week ago. You don't need me to recap every little moment for you. You know what's going on. So we're going to get to it. But I do want to say this, is that going back to Pike now, it's interesting to compare him to what we saw in the cage. Now, again, we don't know, at least I haven't heard, if this takes place before or after the cage. I think we can assume before. So maybe he hasn't gotten to that point that he's at in the cage where he's, illegal. He's got the PTSD from whatever happened on Rigel
7 or
Yeah, whatever it was. So maybe that is why he's a different character. Maybe his character ends up having a tragic arc, that starts here where he's like the cool stepdad who comes in and, takes over the ship and's like, everybody trust me, it's all going to be fine. And, ends up, unfortunately, because of everything that happens before this and into the Rigel 7 and then into the cage where suddenly, his life takes a downturn and then he gets blown up and then we see him in the menagerie. So maybe his whole life does take a tragic turn, and wouldn't that be sad for our Pike that we get to see in this episode? So we get the show starts with a little 2-minute recap of last season. I've mentioned this before.
I'm going to lay out my theory of the show, right? This episode.
Okay. Sure.
So this is how I see it working. It's in 3 parts. Part 1 is let's recap some of last season. Right, we're going to bring up some thematic material. So, we find out about Stamets and his partner and his relationship with Tilly, but we move it forward, right? So he's gonna leave. He's gonna go to the Vulcan Science Academy. Tilly, on the other hand, now firmly in the command program. So she's got, making kind of executive decisions. Well, I've assigned you to this thing, and I've assigned this person to that thing. And we get the recap of, we see the Enterprise come in. We get to, find out it's the Hale with the Enterprise, and that dramatic stuff is recapped. But then we get to meet Pike and develop that. We find, some of the stuff from Burnham, like the storytelling and Alice in Wonderland, and Sarek, but we're going to move it forward. So we bring up some of the old stuff, but we're also going to tease the rest of the season with that stuff. So Very exciting, excellent way to start the first episode of the new season, right? Then we get this middle part, high action, high adventure, right? There's, not a whole lot of, character in it, although we have interesting characters. But it's basically high adventure. And then we get this other part that's interesting in character, and we even had a little hint of Saru in the beginning in that first part where he mentions his sister, which you wouldn't know anything about if you hadn't watched the
Short Treks.
The Short Treks.
Yeah.
But anyway, we get this stuff with Saru and Pike and how are they going to get along, and we get some more kind of development and more moving us forward into the new season. And doing it in a character way rather than an adventure way. So that's how I saw the show. And I thought, this is nice. We get a little something of everything. We get a little bit of recap. We get, as well as teasing. We get a little action adventure. And we get a little character. So it's all very nice. That's how I saw the episode.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I feel like, and I was going to save this for the end, but I'll do it now, is that I feel like this whole episode was just a tease to get to Spock. You know what I mean? I don't feel like a lot happened in this episode, unlike concurrent with what you say, right? It was a lot of like, we got to have a lot of baggage to bring in from last season.
A lot,
so let's bring in that baggage. Let's kind of unpack it a little bit. Let's show everybody what it is. We'll say, here's what's happened in the blah, blah, blah months in between. And then, like you said, with Stamets and everybody else, and then we'll take it forward and move on. So we get that. We get our high adventure. But even their whole trip, their whole mission out to the signal doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
You know what I mean? We just find these other people, but they don't know anything about the signal. We find out that the asteroid's heading towards a pulsar. Yeah. So does that tell us anything? It doesn't seem to yet anyway. So it's interesting because we have this whole episode where plot-wise, a lot of nothing happens.
Right.
And so what we get instead is a bunch of character stuff. And
we get character and setting, my two favorite things.
Right? Well, and I'm not complaining about it. But it's interesting because it feels like ultimately this whole thing was just a big tease to like Spock, right? You guys want to see Spock? You ready for some Spock? Here comes some Spock.
Yeah, they were teasing Spock the whole time.
Yeah.
Right? So we got that moment in which Captain Pike and a science officer and tactical officer are coming on, and Sarek and Burnham look at each other. We're like, oh, we're gonna see Spock. Oh, no Spock. Yep. Oh, we're gonna have some memories of Spock.
Yeah.
But he's a child, and we don't, except for that episode in which Spock goes back through the yesterday's the thing where he rescues himself and in the animated series.
Right.
We know almost nothing about little boy Spock. We get more little boy Spock out of J.J. Trek's reboot than we do out of, normal Star Trek.
Yeah.
So here we're getting some young Spock, some, Spock at home. And, she's got, like, I think 3 or 4 episodes of memories of Spock. So, yeah, it's all teasing Spock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they're building up the Spock. Hopefully we're going to have some great fun with Spock because they've built it up a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And we've learned a lot about that whole family dynamic,
We get the big bomb at the end where she says, the reason that Spock and I are, don't have a relationship, it's all my fault. So she's got some big reveal. She's got some arcs that she has to go down where she could put this back together and then work with Spock and then... But it's going to be about her. I mean, she's the star of the show. I mean, I think Lorca was kind of a co-star because it's hard not to have the captain occupy a big space. And I think this season, it's going to be hard for Captain Pike not to basically be the co-star.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And then I think, once we bring Spock on, he's going to be an important character because, she can't work through her stuff by herself reading Alice in Wonderland. She's got to get with Spock and work on some stuff.
Yes.
So that'll be big.
Well, Sonequa Martin said, Sonequa Martin Green, said that what happens in this season really puts Spock in the place to meet Kirk. So there's a lot of apparently we heard that, Sarek says that his whole goal for Spock and bringing her into the family was for him to learn empathy. And she's like, well, that probably didn't happen because he probably, whatever it was, we don't know yet, obviously, but whatever it was, he was probably starting to learn that empathy, and then she smacked it down by doing whatever it was she did. So
right.
He didn't learn the lesson. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Although I think we're also going to get some of that sense of that relationship between Spock and Pike. I mean, I think we got a decent amount of it in the Cage and the Menagerie to realize that there was a bond between these guys.
Yeah.
And it preceded Kirk.
And they've been through a lot together.
Yeah. And so he's, in some sense, he got Kirk ready because he was, working with Pike.
Well, so it's interesting they bring up the Menagerie because, first of all, what I thought was going to happen when we found out that the Enterprise was in catastrophic failure, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when the Enterprise was in catastrophic, I was half thinking that maybe it was something that Spock had done, because we see him in the Menagerie, we see him in the motion picture. Sometimes when he gets obsessed with something, he's willing to do whatever it takes to get the get the thing done. And so I was wondering, did like he see these signals and they couldn't go after it, so he like, sabotaged the Enterprise in some way? Because the guy even it was Stamets actually who even says like, I've seen the specs on the ship, and whatever did this to this ship, it was major. So I was thinking for a while we were going to see Spock. That's what happened. Spock's like, well, I gotta take care of this thing, and if you're gonna try and stop me, I'm just gonna go off on my own. So I thought in a very menagerie-like way, right? Which is basically what he does to the Enterprise. He takes over the Enterprise and is like, all right, we're gonna go help out Pike now.
And he does it in a muck time, and he's done it several times.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting. It's funny that you would think Starfleet might think he's a liability at some point. But so yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, and again, it'll be fun to see what Spock has done for himself, where he's gone off to. Obviously, it has something to do with the Red Angel and has something to do with the signals we've seen. So, but it'll be interesting to see how it all works out. So, since I brought it up, let's talk about the ship being in catastrophic failure. Any thoughts as to what caused that? Because again, as Stamets says, like whatever did this, it must have been huge. They don't appear to have been battle scarred, but
yeah. So Pike mentions that they were trying to scan things and communicate with the signals, and then they had catastrophic computer failure.
Yeah.
And so we've seen this before with the Enterprise, where it's trying to engage with something it shouldn't. That's either like. There's the episode where they were like getting the information too quickly from not V'ger, but the thing that came before it.
Nomad,
right. So, where Nomad was a danger to the Enterprise because, his data was too fast and he would suck the data too fast out of the computer and so forth, and they had to tell him to slow down. And so I think it's probably something on that level, right? They tapped into something like R2 sticking his little thing in the power and he gets blown across the doorway. Only it's on a ship-wide basis, right?
Yeah.
And so,
it's kind of where I was thinking too. I was thinking that they took some kind of reading, they took some kind of measurement, something happened where he gets sucked into the, gets sucked into
data.
Just overloads and oh my gosh, catastrophic! Holy cow!
And then it cascades, so it's like, well, we've blown like every computer system.
Yeah, exactly.
We can't turn lights on and off. We can't, we can't take readings. We can't, flush toilets. We can't do anything. We're totally stuck.
Yeah.
Got to replace all the computers.
We will get more information on that. Maybe it doesn't matter. We'll see. One interesting factoid that we didn't bring up last year, and I know because I've been going through and listening to some of the old podcasts we did last year on Discovery, we never brought this up, which is that the Enterprise, of course, as we know, is 1701, and the Discovery is 1071. So it's like the same numbers, just two of them are whoop, 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 whoop. Interesting little thought there. So let's talk about the ship's, the crew, I should say, the Discovery's wariness of Pike, right? So it happens almost right away, right? Because Pike comes on and says, all right, look, I wanted to come on and say this myself, but I'm taking over the ship. And immediately Saru's like, no, this doesn't sound right. There are only like 3 reasons why that would happen. And Pike's like, it's all 3 of them. That's why I'm here. But it's funny because he basically told Starfleet, no, don't tell them. I'll come aboard and tell them myself. But you would think with everything that they've been through with Lorca, that would just be easier if Star Trek or if Starfleet, came aboard and, even, let's bring back Admiral Cronwell or whatever her name was.
I've seen her in the trailers for this season. So.
Right. So she'll be there.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's not even like they couldn't get the actress. Like, let's just do this.
Because in one sense, you'd say like, listen, this is our, we got, one of our great captains who's currently without a ship. We got a ship without a captain. It just makes sense for command for us to put Pike on your ship until his ship is back at it.
Yeah. And he's super experienced, one we trust.
And we've established that because when Saru in the first season was, trying to, think about the great captains and how should he behave now that he's going to assume this role. One of the captains that he had considered was Christopher Pike.
Mm. So this is interesting, is that they had to redesign the Enterprise because of the whole rights issues over TV, movies, blah, blah, that whole weird Viacom thing that's happening. So if you notice that the Enterprise has a lot more like angles on it than it normally does, they're sharper.
I do. I've got lots of pictures of the Enterprise from those couple of seconds that we saw, right?
Yeah.
I got lots of screenshots, and I've got, one up here on this computer and one on that computer, and so I admire them constantly.
Yeah.
I really like the look of this Enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like it fits in with contemporary ships, right? So, for example, playing in Star Trek Online, if you go back and you get the original series ship, right? You're flying around in this ship that aesthetically looks different, right? It doesn't fit in. And even when you get the original movie era ship, which I have right behind me.
Right.
So, it doesn't have colorful, the red here in the nacelles. It doesn't have the blue here. Yeah. And that's kind of become standard. We even see it in Enterprise. And, of course, the original ship did have the red, but it was like a plastic dome kind of a thing. It didn't look like it was this glowing, whatever. I guess they're Bussard collectors, collecting hydrogen, according to the technical manual. So it's just a different look. Plus, it's cleaner and whiter and has less going on the hull. Whereas if you look at the Galaxy class and all the ships that come into Next Generation, which are being designed within the same span of years by the same basic team.
Yeah.
And they kind of make everything look the same, right? It's the Ambassador class and, the Cheyenne class and the Constellation class, and then we get the Sovereign class and the Akira and all the stuff that comes out within kind of the Next Generation DS9 time zone. They all kind of have this plating and this, stuff that seems to be going on in the hull of the ship, and that's all missing from the early. And I think, just looking, I can see it right now because it's on my screen. And this Enterprise looks like it belongs in the world with those other Enterprises.
Uh-huh.
It looks like it's got more stuff on the hull, more, like if you touched it, it would have texture rather than the clean smoothness.
Yeah.
Kind of 1970s jumpsuit Star Trek or, jumpsuit science fiction, right?
Yeah.
Where everything's clean and that's part of the aesthetic, I think, of Star Trek, this cleanness. But we've got this established, like, this is how ships look. And for the original ship and the movie refit to have a different look feels awkward. Whereas the ship that meets Discovery in those last couple of seconds, in the first seconds of these seasons, I see the blue glow. I see the red glow. It's got all the pieces that you expect from all the other Star Trek, other than the TV show that was made 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the movies that were, again, kind of one-off-ish in the sense that they had one ship. They didn't design a fleet. Just adding the Excelsior was like, ooh, we've got a second ship, and of course then when they added the Miranda class, it was basically just a saucer section of the Enterprise with its nacelles kind of stuck underneath it, and it was like they just took the same pieces and put them. So we have like 3 ships, right? Whereas by the time you watch the 14 years of Next Generation and DS9, you've seen so many ships, this fleet of ships.
Yeah.
And they all have a consistent aesthetic.
Right.
Right? They all look like they belong in a fleet together. And then you got these other ships that don't look like they belong. And now finally we have an Enterprise that looks like it belongs. Huzzah.
Huzzah. Love it. So obviously all my notes are in order because as I was watching them, I was writing down notes. So so we get that opening piece where from last season where where we see the Enterprise, right? And then it kind of goes to black for a second, and then we cut to this thing where Burnham is saying, space, the final frontier. She gets her shot there to do it. And you think like, oh, is this a new opening? What's happening here? But then it just turns out it eventually leads into the story of her joining, Sarek and his family and everything else. But it was just so weird. It felt like if they had just started the show there, that would have been one thing. But it was just weird coming off of that interlude from the time before. I don't know. I thought it was weird. Because it starts with the Cassini, spacecraft that we launched that, looked all over Saturn and just recently, crash landed in the big planet. But it's
probably good news for us because otherwise it would have gained some kind of super intelligence and come back and destroy us.
Right. Later, a million years from now.
Apparently 300 years from now.
But that was even weirder. But, so that was even weirder because we start off with this thing and it's showing us, images that the Cassini sent back of Saturn and its rings and blah, blah, blah. And the next thing you know, it takes us into her. I don't know. That whole montage for me just didn't really work. That's pretty much all I'm trying to tell you. Although I did find out this interesting factoid about the Cassini is that after 20 years in space, 13 of those exploring Saturn, which is a lot, obviously exploring one planet and its moons, Cassini exhausted its fuel supply. And so, to protect moons of Saturn that could have conditions suitable for life, Cassini was sent onto one daring final mission that would seal its fate. After a series of nearly 24 nail-biting dives between the planet and its icy rings, Cassini plunged into Saturn's atmosphere on September 15, 2007, returning science data to the very end. Or it was eventually smushed because of the pressure.
So we imagine.
Yes. Exactly.
Perhaps it's gaining a super intelligence right now.
Yeah, we don't know what's happening on Saturn.
Maybe that's what the Transformers come from.
Right? Exactly. We don't even know. We're more than meets the eye, after all. Anyway, all of that to say, we do get the beginning of Burnham's actual, first time in the house. We saw last season the mind meld, Sarek putting his Katra inside her, or vice versa, however it works, or joining together. So this is the first time her coming to the house, first time her meeting Amanda, the first time her meeting Spock. What stood out to you about this little first part here?
I think, so we get these tantalizing images and moments with Spock, but the character we really learn the most about is Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
And Amanda's very warm, and in some ways, you'd have to. We've recently watched Journey to Babel, and she's got a real presence, Amanda, right?
Yeah.
And of course, she's played by Jane Wyatt.
Best known for playing a mother.
Right. But also, kind of an A-lister in her day, right?
Yeah.
And, she brought a lot to the character. It was a compelling character. And so playing Amanda, you've got a bar to go after. You got some shoes to fill.
Very true. I thought it was interesting Spock slamming the door on her the first time. I wondered if this was like an only child thing, when they bring home the baby for the first time and they're just like, no, I don't want to see this new thing, blah, blah, blah. But all of this really made me think about Sarek's character. And we touched a little bit on this last time, but I had brought up the idea that Sarek must have more emotions brewing under him than your average Vulcan, right? After all, he's taking a human wife. He's got a half Vulcan, half human son. He now brings in a fully human daughter to sort of, round out the family dynamic.
We get that thing from the Journey to Babel about how he was like ambassador on Earth, and he, studying human culture, and he falls in love with the human woman, or whatever it was. It seemed logical at the time to marry her.
Right.
And so he's got a thing with humans, right? He's got a thing with Earth. He's got a thing with what's going on with humans, and he's trying to figure out how do we how do we get the good stuff? Keep what's good about being a Vulcan, but tap into because the humans are cool. They got good stuff. If you watch the whole arc of the Vulcans, right?
Right.
They start off, as I have mentioned before, way more Romulan, way more aloof, standoffish, and arrogant, and kind of unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
As would be appropriate for the villainous Romulans. And they really mellow over time, and I think it's their contact with the humans.
Right.
And Sarek is obviously totally on board with that project.
I must say, so if you remember last season, there was the one where he was caught somewhere. He got stuck somewhere. Oh, the bad guy blew up his ship, remember? And he was stuck on the ship, and they were trying to find him. And so he kept going into kept going into his Katra to find him. And he kept kicking her out because he was reliving his biggest regret, which was keeping her out of the Science Academy. And so it was funny because at that time you were like, well, all of this is probably just buried in his subconscious. And maybe it still all is, but it's interesting how much, again, we look at all this humanality. It was what I was going to say, the humanality of him. But the human emotion. Yes, exactly. That the humanosity that he must have boiling under his very, Vulcan veneer.
No one has been more human.
That's right. Interesting. We got some different opening credits going on here. We see the Red Angel. We see the captain's chair. The Edict is in there. There are one or two other very big differences. So it's kind of, we'll see how all of those play in. Obviously, the captain chair looms large in this season. So it's funny, on the way to the transporter, when she still thinks she's going to see Spock, right? Saru can smell her anxiousness to see him again. I was like, oh, that's a new trick. I don't think we've heard about that one before. I also wondered too about when she asks him about his sister, and he says I've got a sister and there's a blah blah. Wouldn't she know that already? They've spent 7 years together on the Shinzu, and then however long here. It just feels like, even if nothing else, the circumstances in which he came to the ship, Giorgio knew that, and wouldn't they just sitting around talking sometime? I don't know. It just felt like that was information they should have had. But
yeah, it probably is, but they needed to put it out at this point, so we just have to do a little exposition as if it's new information. But it's kind of like when they're all standing around explaining how Star Trek works, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, our phasers are amplified light through, crystals, and you're like, yeah, well, obviously everyone knows this, but someone's got to explain it. Or how we can't beam them up through the shields. And there's a moment where Saru is talking about the shields and and the transporter, and of course we all know this, right? Because we're Star Trek people. But you need to have that in there, because otherwise people are like, what's the dilemma? I don't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
If their shields just protect them against these asteroids.
Two other little things right around this area. The first was, three actually. The first was, I love the little moment when Pike mentions the Mojave, because you remember from the in the cage when he talks about having lived there or whatever, or being from there. The second one was they pull out for a second and you see the interior of the ship where the turbo lift is. And it's all dark, and I'm like, that's not how I imagined that to be at all. I certainly much more thought of it as an elevator going around, the different cabins and whatnot. I'm like, where's all this black? I don't understand how this works. I didn't like that. And speaking of not liking, I was just wondering what your opinion was on the elevator scene with the alien who, oh yeah, there's a lot of that going around, and then sneezes. Yeah. I was like, I don't know, this feels like a little too goofy
silly
for me. Yes,
yeah, well, obviously, Roddenberry was not in the office when that got through.
No, that's definitely true.
Because he was not fond of broad humor. But, obviously, it was our other Gene Kuhn.
Gene Kuhn, yes.
Obviously, he was chuckling to himself the whole time.
I bet he was. So we also find out, too, that the spore drive is inactive. We can talk about this now. So the spore drive's inactive. It's not working now. But we did find that as we got closer to that asteroid at the end, that the spores, reacted to it just like they did to the tardigrade. So I'm wondering, you have any thoughts, ideas on where this whole asteroid that they catch at the end might be going, where that storyline's going?
I don't know. They're planting a lot of seeds here in this first episode.
Obviously, they got a whole season
as
to
you
take.
say. Yeah, well, I mean, it's very JJ, right?
Yep.
Half of these may never get opened, these seeds. But it's kind of how we work today. And if you're going to have the archy multiple stories, you got to lay a bunch of seeds so that different things can be happening and people can be working on things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, I have no guesses either. I don't know if this is going to become like the new power of the spore drive. But again, then why isn't the spore drive everywhere? Although maybe this asteroid doesn't exist everywhere and there's only enough for like Discovery is going to be the one ship that, I don't know. Something.
Or
Also,
they have just enough to make the 4 other jumps to visit the other angel.
Yes, exactly. How convenient. And we know from the trailer, as you've said, having watched it, we know in the trailer that they use the spore drive. So it should be interesting to see. Interesting here, too. I thought that we get Stamets gets to go and teach at the Vulcan Academy, and yet they wouldn't take both Spock and Burnham. Like, we got a human now teaching at the Vulcan Academy. I wonder how everyone feels about that.
I guess that's because his spore science is so amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. When you talk about like breaking down drama and what it is, there's always one piece that they call universality. Like what's something in the script that really everybody can sort of like, when they hit on it, everyone's kind of like, yeah, I know that feeling. And so I thought it was interesting when Stamets says, Hugh is everywhere that I look. Because I think that that's something that a lot of people can relate to, even if they've lost somebody due to death, or there's even a friend of mine who, she just got divorced, and so she's moving because she's just like literally every restaurant I go to, every bar, every the place I'm living.
Not to mention the house, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Everywhere is I just see him, so it's like I gotta get out of this town. So I just thought that was a nice little piece of universality there that everyone could latch onto.
Yeah, so like one of the comments that I saw on Rotten Tomatoes was that Rap has been given an unreasonable amount of dramatic heavy lifting and carried it off with aplomb, which I thought was totally true.
I love that. That's good. Quickly in the scene where we get Sarek and Burnham, where they're going back and forth, and he finds her reading Alice in Wonderland, right? And see, again here, it's just another thing to talk about the emotional level that he must have, because he says, it gave me comfort, too, to hear her read that story. Or yours wasn't the only one, is what he actually says. But so I thought that was interesting.
I totally imagine that he's getting something entirely different, right? Like he's like, look at the Earth Mother caring for her, her young. That's how a mother should be. Yeah, we gotta get some of that for the future of Vulcan.
Right. We also quickly find out in that scene that L'Rell is now the High Chancellor of the Klingon Empire. We know we're going to see her later, too, so that's going to be fun. Later on the ship, we get Pike. He calls for the roll call of everybody, so he can learn everybody's name really quick. I'm assuming maybe it's also like a team builder. I don't know what exactly is going on there, but I thought that was good. And then he gives everybody their little assignment, and then he says, "And Detmer, fly good." Thought that was funny. So this is where we start to also learn. So now, sorry. What I was saying is that we get to where we find the medical frigate, right? And everyone's kind of throwing out their ideas. And 2 interesting things happen here, which is first, Pike totally loses it, right? Because he feels like everybody's giving him all of this, negative, blah, 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 blah. Not realizing all they're doing is, listing, okay, here's what the problems that we have to overcome. How can we overcome these problems, right? That's really what they're doing. They're all just talking out loud. Hive mind, almost, And but he loses it here, and he says, and this is the first time we find out the interesting thing that he says, I didn't sit out the war just to lose nerve now. Lose nerve now. That's hard to say. So interesting that we find out here. This is the first time we find out he wasn't a part of the war. What was the Enterprise doing? And it's interesting because I read an article that was saying, this is a common problem we have in Trek, right? Where somehow the Enterprise is just not where everybody else is. We have DS9 happening. There's this giant war happening for the Quadrant. We're really worried about it. They're fighting the Kardashians and everything else. And then, meanwhile, the Enterprise is off finding the Fountain of Youth, in Star Trek Insurrection. So it's fun that they deal with that here.
And it wouldn't be hard because there's a lot of ship name dropping that goes on in Star Trek in general, right? Even in the original series. We'll name drop other ships. And it would have been so easy just to be like, the Enterprise is leading the defense of Bayshore.
Right.
Okay, well, we know where the Enterprise is. Okay, done.
Exactly.
It's not like we need to go to Picard and Troy and Luxwana and like, no, we must protect Bayshore. Oh, here they come. We can't hold them back.
Yeah.
Bayshore falls.
Which is exactly what I felt about this, right? They did... there must be another story. I know that they're putting out a book in next July of all times. They're putting out a book that tells us where the ship was during this whole time. But just because they didn't mention that they were there doesn't mean that they couldn't have been off fighting the war somewhere else. You know what I mean?
Right.
Maybe they weren't at Battle of Binary Stars, but they were off, near Rigel 7 or somewhere else, dealing with something.
Probably laying the seeds for things that would go bad 10 years later, or how many years.
Right. Which is interesting. Then we get so then we get the first bit of it here, and then later towards the end of the episode, we get, him saying like, why did they leave us behind? It was hard on me. It was hard on Spock. It was hard on the rest of the crew. And Spock even has that great line where he says, what's the logic in sitting it out if there's nothing to go back to? We get that great line, which, by the way, apparently was also... it was the next line. So then, I'm going to look it up. He comes back with something saying that he taught us that logic is just the beginning, or is just the beginning of wisdom, not the end.
Yeah.
Which apparently was a Leonard Nimoy line.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that he had said. So it was nice that they brought it back to that. But it's interesting. We get him dealing with like almost anti-PTSD, right? Or the guilt of not being around to save his other, Starfleet buddies.
This is so like one example of PTSD that you can develop is the why did I survive, right?
Yeah.
So you're in a car crash, everyone in the car dies except you. You're like, well, why did I survive?
Yeah.
Or so he's got, I think, that kind of trauma to deal with. Especially you come back and just on this bridge, we got people with the head thing and...
Yeah, right.
People have been injured in the war, right? You come back and people have lost things, or now I've got my new bionic leg or whatever, and... nobody here was hurt. We're all okay. In fact, Jeff over here now has, like, silver eyes. I don't know, he can move things with his mind, but it's okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Also, a side note on that, mentioning the other crew is that they mentioned that there were 203 crew members on the Enterprise, which is the same number he gives in The Cage as well. Mm-hmm. 203 crew members. So it was a nice little like ding ding that they gave there. Especially
because later on, at various points, Shatner as Kirk tells us it's more like 400.
Yeah.
So
they were running with a skeleton crew back then, they...
Obviously, they've got more crew on the ship.
Yeah. Well, it's the next generation. They got a whole new bunch of people coming in, Starfleet. Well,
obviously, there have been refits before the refit.
Yeah, exactly. So then they all go down in the pods. We all know that thing happened. But we get the death of their science officer, Conley, here, right? Well... Other than, like, space is risky, which, of course, Roddenberry was a big proponent of, like, is there any other point to this death? There's no room for cocky in Starfleet? I don't know.
He was made intentionally obnoxious from the beginning.
Right.
And, other than he's the red shirt of the episode, even though he's wearing some blue.
Yeah.
I don't really see the point.
Yeah, it was just weird.
I mean,
Just to clear the way for her to be science officer? I don't know.
Well, and she gets to be right, and she gets to be right in a way that seems like she has some understanding of things. She goes beyond mere, in the same way that Spock, logic is the beginning of wisdom. Yeah. He can't seem to get past the, it's not just the math and the sensors. No, my math is fantastic. Don't challenge my calculations.
Right, exactly.
She gets that kind of being pointed out that she's right about stuff.
Yeah. Because she's the hero.
That's right.
So then once we get down to that ship, the medical frigate here, we get that lead survivor. The engineer is played by Tig Notaro. She's a pretty famous comedian. She has her own television show, but also that she's most famous for recently. This is a few years ago this happened, but recently in modern times, she found out one day that she had cancer, and so she didn't even tell anybody, and then went out on stage that night and told everybody in the audience and just did a whole set about cancer and how awful it is and what it means that you have it and blah blah blah. And so people who have heard it, it's on the internet, you can find it. People who have heard it just says it's like one of the most daring bits of stand-up that's been done in years. So it's just cool that she's on the show. She's also a big Trek fan, so.
Very cool.
Yep. So interesting thing here. So they're in there and she tells them to, remove the helmets. And so Pike hits the button. But then at the very end, when Burnham's running out, she just says, helmet! It's like we were saying with the last season, we talked about this too with the doors, right? When the tardigrade got out and then it goes back into its little thing and they're like, door! We're like, boy, that would have been a lot more helpful on Next Generation if they just could have had voice commands on these things. Here you go, another perfect example of Alexa at work.
That's right.
I think that we have hit most of everything I wanted to talk about here. From what I've been seeing is that most of the reviews were either I thought it was really great, or a lot of them were we're cautiously optimistic. We'll see what they do with Spock. I think that's really the big thing that's going to make or break this season is how they take care of that character. Mm-hmm. Just from everything I've been reading. Well, anything else we didn't get to talk about? Anything else you wanted to share?
No, I think we hit all of our points.
I think so too. I think that this season is going to be really awesome. I too think that the whole season kind of does hinge on how Spock, what the character they do with that character, how cool he is, how even how different he is. And it's funny too because a lot of people are making a big deal about this beard, but we've seen bearded Spock before, right? At the beginning of Motion Picture.
That's right.
If you all want to see a bearded Leonard Nimoy, go to the Motion Picture.
And we also get to see a bearded McCoy.
Really? Oh yeah, when he first comes on board. That's right.
Someone reactivated me using a little-known clause of.
Right,
wait,
exactly.
It was you. You did it. Bones, I needed you. There's something out there. Why do we call everything we don't understand something like it's just...
So great. Sounds just like Bones. I love it. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for tuning in this week, for listening in. We got lots of things going on here. Come to the website, thebrothers.trekabout.com. Go to the Facebook page, and we'll show you there when we're posting. We're also going to be on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and, of course, SoundCloud. So you can find us and listen to us anytime you want on those. If you want to go back and listen to last season of Discovery, those are all there as well. So go find them and enjoy them and listen to them. My name is Matt, saying goodbye, and from Houston, my brother Ken, saying goodbye.
Peace and long life.
Here you go, and we will see you all for Discovery next week.